Nicolas Maduro, a name that echoes through the streets of Venezuela, whispered in both fear and defiance. For some, he is the embodiment of power. For others, he is a symbol of everything lost. But behind that name is a man, and to be that man is to bear a weight few can imagine. Power. Real power. In the case of Maduro, is a chain that tightens with every passing day. Imagine holding the reins of a nation in crisis, where every decision is a gamble, and every moment is a balancing act on the edge of collapse. For Nicolas Maduro, this is not just theory, it is his daily reality. A reality where power comes at a price, where the very office meant to elevate him would feel like a prison to most people. To be Nicolas Maduro is not to live in triumph. It is to navigate a minefield of enemies, some lurking in the shadows, others shouting from the rooftops. It is to sit in the eye of a storm, where each breath could be your last moment of peace before the world around you implodes. How do you lead when your every move is watched, when your every word could be your undoing? To be Nicolas Maduro is to live a life few could endure. It is to wake up each day wondering if this will be the day it all falls apart. This is not the story of a man in control. It is the story of a man caught in the iron grip of power's most dangerous edge. In this video, I'll be discussing how Nicolas Maduro rose to power, the failed 2020 Operation Gideon that sought to depose him, the time he was almost assassinated by a drone attack, and why the US has placed a staggering $15 million bounty on his head for information leading to his arrest. These moments that I will be discussing in this video are not just chapters in his life, but they are the very forces that have influenced his presidency. This is Nicolas Maduro's Venezuela, and you would not want to be the man or woman walking in his shoes. Welcome to Le Coup Archives, where I aim to explore the coup d'etats and armed conflicts that have shaped history and influenced our world today. Before we start, please subscribe and smash the like button if you enjoy educational content like this. With that being said, let the video commence. Born to a working-class family that raised them in Calle 14, a street in Los Jardines El Valle, on the western outskirts of Caracas, Maduro's early life was a far cry from the political battlefield he would one day navigate. The son of Teresa de Jesus Moros and Nicolas Maduro Garcia, a trade union leader, young Nicolas grew up amidst the rhythms of the everyday Venezuelan worker. But there was more to the man than a future in labor. Before politics, before the presidency, there was music. For a brief time, Maduro was a member of a rock band called Enigma, a fleeting glimpse into a life he might have lived if fate had not intervened. Perhaps he found some freedom in those chords, a momentary escape from the expectations placed upon him. Yet, music was not the future calling him. When the rock band's notes faded, he took up a different kind of rhythm, the steady hum of the Caracas metro. Maduro became a bus driver, an ordinary man in an extraordinary time. But the bus routes of Caracas soon became the paths to political activism. Representing the bus drivers of the Caracas Metro Maduro found his first foothold in the world of politics as an unofficial trade unionist. It was here that his journey toward leadership truly began. His political education, however, was not limited to the streets of Caracas. In 1986, at the age of 24, Maduro took his next step, this time to Havana, Cuba, where he attended a one-year course at the Escuela Nacional de Cuadros Julio Antonio Mella. Here, he was mentored by Pedro Miret Prieto, a senior member of the Cuban Communist Party's Politburo and close ally of Fidel Castro. It was in Cuba that Maduro was fully forged in the fires of leftist ideology, learning the strategies and rhetoric that would later define his rule. But Maduro's true rise began when he became part of the MBR 200, the civilian wing of Hugo Chávez's military movement. He campaigned tirelessly for Chávez's release from prison, and when Chávez was freed, Maduro stood by his side. In the late 1990s, he was instrumental in forming the movement of the Fifth Republic, a political machine that propelled Chávez to power. And in 1999, Nicolas Maduro stood at the crossroads of history as a member of the National Constituent Assembly, tasked with reshaping the very constitution that would pave the way for Hugo Chávez's rise to power. Maduro, once a humble union leader, was now positioned as a key architect in the revolutionary movement that promised to redefine Venezuela. Chávez saw in him a loyal disciple, one whose unwavering dedication would lead to his appointment as foreign minister in 2006. In this role, Maduro became the voice of Venezuela on the world stage, unafraid to challenge the might of the United States, even going so far to compare Guantanamo Bay to a Holocaust detention camp, a bold and controversial rebuke to U.S. policy. By 2012, Maduro's ascent continued as he took on the mantle of vice president. As Chávez lay dying, his body ravaged by cancer, he cast his gaze toward the future of Venezuela, placing his trust in one man, Nicolas Maduro. In his final days, Chávez urged the nation to rally behind Maduro, whom he called a complete revolutionary, a man of great experience despite his youth, with great dedication and capacity for work, for leading, for handling the most difficult situations. It was an anointment, a transfer of revolutionary flame from one leader to the next. Maduro, now Chávez's chosen protege, campaigned as the living embodiment of his predecessor's legacy. He invoked Chávez's memory at every turn, speaking in front of portraits of the late leader, quoting him as if his words alone could breathe life back into the revolution. But it was one surreal moment on national television that would capture the imagination of many. Maduro recounted how Chávez's spirit visited him from beyond the grave in the form of a songbird. All of a sudden, a little bird circled 3 times around me, stopped on a wooden beam, and began to sing a pretty song, Maduro said, recalling the encounter. Then I too began to whistle, he added, imitating the bird. The little bird looked at me in a strange way. He sang, circled me once, and flew away, and I felt his spirit. I felt him giving us a blessing, saying, now the battle begins. Go to victory. It was a powerful image. Maduro, blessed by the spirit of Chávez, entrusted with leading the revolution forward. Running on a socialist platform, Maduro positioned himself as the last bulwark against the forces of oligarchy. In April 2013, he narrowly won the election by just 1.5%. securing a 6-year term, not through overwhelming support, but by clinging to the lingering spirit of a fallen leader. From the very start, Maduro's presidency was marked by opposition. His opponents regained control of parliament and launched a unified effort to oust him, an effort that would fail, but not without weakening his grip on power. In 2017, Maduro held an election to replace the opposition-led National Assembly with a pro-Maduro body called the National Constituent Assembly, which granted him the power to rewrite the Constitution. He claimed it was for reconciliation and peace, but critics knew better. This was a blatant attempt to consolidate control, to sideline his enemies. Maduro declared victory, but beneath the surface, the foundations of that claim were already cracking. His opponents cried foul, alleging widespread fraud, casting a long shadow over his supposed triumph. What should have been a moment of consolidation turned into a battlefield of accusations. With his legitimacy under siege, both at home and abroad, the international community responded with swift condemnation. The US, the European Union, and several Latin American nations refused to recognize the new government body, signaling their rejection of the legitimacy of the vote. Meanwhile, Venezuela's economic crisis deepened, and with it, Maduro's desperation. The nation's once prosperous oil industry crumbled, inflation soared, shelves emptied, streets filled with protesters, and Maduro's regime became increasingly autocratic. He postponed regional elections and imprisoned political opponents, tightening his grip on power, while his people suffered. Behind the scenes, Maduro ensured the military's loyalty through corruption. 2,000 generals and admirals, more top positions than almost any other country in the world. Venezuela's military became a bloated institution of profiteers. Maduro turns the profiteers into accomplices, their loyalty guaranteed by self-interest. They knew that the fall of the regime could mean long prison sentences, and so they clung to Maduro as tightly as he clung to them. Internationally, Maduro forged alliances with anti-Western powers: Russia, China, Iran, and Turkey. These relationships, especially with Russia, which supplied Venezuela with arms valued at billions, propped up his fragile regime. In the shadows of these alliances, illicit activities flourished. Illegal gold mining in the Amazon and cocaine smuggling from Colombia became lifelines for a regime desperate to hold on. Imagine the scene. A bright day in August 2018, the Venezuelan sky hanging heavy with anticipation as Nicolas Maduro addresses a military parade in Caracas. The president stands tall at 6'3", the figurehead of a fractured nation, framed by the weight of his own words. Soldiers stand in formation, a reflection of state power, and the streets pulse with the rhythms of national pride and chaos alike. Then, suddenly, everything changes. The crackle of an explosion tears through the air, shattering the fragile calm. In an instant, the world is tipped into confusion. At first, no one knows what has happened. Soldiers scatter, civilians scream, and Maduro's bodyguards spring into action, throwing themselves in front of the president to shield him from an unseen threat. It's pandemonium, a swirl of smoke and panic, of fear and uncertainty. As the dust begins to settle, one fact emerges: drones. 2 of them had flown over the crowd. One was set to explode above the president, and the other was to detonate in front of him. The drones had malfunctioned, exploding prematurely, injuring 7 members of the Venezuelan National Guard, but sparing Maduro's life. I am alive and victorious. This is an attempt to kill me, Maduro later declared that day on state television, his voice firm, his face resolute. The chaos of the day had barely subsided, but Maduro was already assigning blame. They have tried to assassinate me today, and everything points to the Venezuelan ultra-right in alliance with the Colombian far-right, he proclaimed, the finger of accusation pointing outwards, away from the cracks forming in his own country. He named the names Juan Manuel Santos, Colombia's president at the time, became the prime suspect in Maduro's narrative. But there was a shield of love that always protects us, he added with almost mythical reverence for the unseen force he believed had spared him. This was no ordinary attack. This was in fact the world's first known attempt to kill a sitting head of state using commercially available drones. The drones used in this attack were not sophisticated military equipment. No, they were DJI M600 drones, the kind you could buy online for a few $1,000s, generally used by filmmakers to carry cameras or other gear. But in this case, the payload wasn't a camera, it was a kilogram of C4 explosives, the power to cause devastation carefully strapped beneath these flying machines. The attackers had customized these drones to turn hobbyist tools into a weapon of assassination. The attackers were organized, calculating, and for a moment seemed capable of pulling off a plot that could have altered Venezuelan history in a heartbeat. They were a group of defectors from the Venezuelan military, plotting on a rented farm in rural Colombia. Their plan was bold: to assassinate a sitting president, to destabilize a nation already teetering on the edge of collapse. Weeks before the parade, they had ordered the drones online, fitted them with explosives, and carefully choreographed their movements from afar. The attack was meticulously planned, but it was ultimately foiled. The cell phone signal blockers that protect Maduro, a president long paranoid of assassination, activated just in time. The drones exploded prematurely. One crashed into an apartment building 2 blocks away, while the other failed to reach its target. In a matter of seconds, what could have been a world-shaking moment became just another chapter in the long and fraught story of Maduro's presidency. In the aftermath, the Venezuelan government wasted no time in rounding up suspects. Dozens were arrested, and some were tortured. According to activists, Maduro's accusations against Colombia and the ultra-right seemed to serve a dual purpose, not just to seek justice, but to justify further crackdowns on his political opponents. But Colombia's government was quick to deny the accusations. It is customary for Maduro to permanently blame Colombia for any type of situation, they retorted, denying any involvement. In this, Maduro's presidency becomes an image of survival, one where every attack, every accusation is met not just with defiance, but with suspicion. The drones that flew over Caracas that day were not just physical threats. They were symbols of a broader malaise, a growing instability that surrounded a leader constantly under siege. The sands of Castilletes, northern Colombia, glowed a dull amber under the weight of a moonless sky. 2 men stood on the barren beach, their faces marked by a silent strain of waiting for a signal, a word, anything to confirm the beginning of their bold, reckless mission. It was May 2nd, 2020. They were both former special forces, veterans of battles long since fought, men molded by the crucible of war. And yet, on this night, they were nothing more than shadows cast by a flickering flame, perched on the edge of an abyss that few could comprehend. Their mission? Overthrow a regime. And their enemy? Nicolas Maduro, the embattled and controversial president of Venezuela. This was no ordinary coup, though. This was Operation Gideon, a name that evoked the biblical figure who defied impossible odds with a small ragtag army. But unlike its namesake, this operation would be doomed before it even began. A twisted tale of ambition, betrayal, and the grotesque miscalculations of men who believed they could alter the course of history. The origins of this quixotic plan trace back to September 2019 when Jordan Gaudreau, an intense ex-Green Beret, presented a daring proposal to Juan Jose Rendon, an advisor to Venezuela's opposition leader, Juan Guaido. Gaudreau, with the swagger of a soldier turned mercenary, envisioned a swift surgical strike on Venezuela's heart. A coup to capture Maduro and his key officials, dragging them from their strongholds and handing them over to awaiting American forces. In return, Gaudreau asked for $212 million, payable in barrels of Venezuelan oil if the coup succeeded. This was not the only coup on the table. Eric Prince, the infamous founder of Blackwater, had floated his own proposition: 5,000 mercenaries and $500 million to topple Maduro. But Prince's plan, steeped in the high price tag of war, was soon sidelined. Gaudreau's plan seemed like the better bargain. A scrappy David against the Goliath of a bloated dictatorship. By October 16, 2019, the General Services Agreement between Silver Corps USA and the Guaido administration was signed, laying the foundation for the plot. But almost as soon as the ink dried, the cracks began to show. Gaudreau, impulsive and erratic, demanded an immediate payment of $1.5 million as a retainer. Rendon, wary of Gaudreau's sudden insistence on money, hesitated. The first payment came not from the Venezuelan coffers, but from Rendon's own account, a meager $50,000, an offering to buy more time. The deal between Gaudreau and the Guaido camp was crumbling. By November 2019, after a fiery argument between the two men, Rendon and his associates considered the operation dead. But Gaudreau had other plans. The ex-soldier refused to accept that his coup had been buried. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps it was the desperation of a man too deep in the game to quit. Whatever it was, he pushed forward. He convinced himself that destiny lay just beyond the horizon, on the shores of Venezuela, where his ragtag force would storm the beaches like heroes of old. And so, on that moonless night in May, 2 Americans and 50 Venezuelan revolutionaries prepared to take their shot at immortality. The winds howled as if the very earth itself was warning them to turn back. The sea churned under the weight of their flat-bottomed boats. Loaded with guns, ammunition, and ambition, they were supposed to have set sail at 5 p.m., but nature was not on their side. Hour after hour passed as they waited for the winds to die down. One pilot boat carrying 11 men had already shipped out, but the others remained, awaiting the signal from Gaudreau. who was some 1,100 miles away in Florida. The boat he had intended to join the mission had broken down. Now he sat in the dim light of a satellite phone, poring over weather forecasts, hoping the gods of war would grant him one more chance. At 8 p.m., the winds finally lulled. Gaudreau gave the order. It was time. But the sea, as it so often does, had its own plans. The Venezuelan revolutionaries, men who had trained on land, were no match for the churning waters. Seasickness took hold, reducing these would-be liberators to groaning, vomiting passengers on a doomed voyage. The Americans, former Staff Sergeant Luke Denman and Sergeant Arian Barry, could only watch as their comrades succumbed to the unforgiving ocean. And that was just the beginning. As the boats pushed forward, the lines of communication with Gaudreau began to falter. Hourly calls failed to go through, and one critical miscommunication, Gaudreau believed the boats had turned back to Colombia, when in reality they had pressed on, sailing straight into the heart of enemy territory. One boat's engine gave out. Fuel ran dangerously low. Then came the fatal blow. Venezuelan fishing boats spotted one of the vessels and alerted the government. The pilot boat, the first to make contact with Venezuelan waters, was quickly overtaken by Maduro's forces. 6 men were deleted in the ensuing skirmish. The second boat carrying Denman and Barry and the bulk of the revolutionaries met a similar fate. By the time they reached the coastal town of Macuto, it was over. They were captured without a fight. In propaganda videos released soon after, Denman and Barry could be seen, hands raised in the air, their faces blank as the reality of their failure set in. The mission was a catastrophe, a blunder so staggering it made history's greatest failed coup attempts seem like masterstrokes. Among the supplies captured were a high-end BB gun and a Kindle e-reader, an absurd juxtaposition to the high-stakes game they had been playing. Denman and Barry, the Americans who were supposed to be the sharp edge of this mission, hardly spoke a word of Spanish, making them ill-suited to navigate the complexities of Venezuela's political landscape. The mission's failure, though, had been long in the making. Maduro's government had infiltrated Operation Gideon before it even began. "We knew everything," Maduro boasted in his first public address after the coup attempt. What they were talking about, what they ate, what they drank, who financed them. The plan had been exposed long before the first boat ever set sail. Even more stunning, the coup had been openly discussed on Venezuelan television. Silvercore USA had tweeted about the mission on May 3rd, the very day the boats were intercepted, and the Associated Press had published an article detailing the plot before the attack was even underway. Operation Gideon, once a whisper in the halls of power, had become a farce for the world to see. Back in the US, the Trump administration scrambled to distance itself from the botched operation. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo insisted there was no direct involvement by the US government. Guaido, the very man Gaudreau had sought to restore to power, denied any personal connection to the plan, his signature on the General Services Agreement a distant memory. But in Venezuela, the consequences were severe. Maduro's Attorney General announced that Denman and Barry would face charges of terrorism, conspiracy, and illicit trafficking of weapons of war, charges that carried a maximum prison sentence of 25 to 30 years. Both men, after admitting to the charges, were sentenced to 20 years in a Venezuelan prison. Their dreams of toppling Maduro reduced to nothing more than a footnote in history. For Nicolas Maduro, Operation Gideon was not just a victory, it was an affirmation of his hold on power, a failed coup that only served to consolidate his position, leaving his enemies humiliated, dead, or imprisoned. The specter of foreign interference, once a threat, had been reduced to a poorly executed invasion that ended in defeat on a Venezuelan beach.
The Department of Justice is announcing the unsealing of a superseding indictment filed in the Southern District of New York against 4 defendants, including Nicolas Maduro, as well as the current head of Venezuela's Constituent Assembly, the former director of military intelligence, and a former high-ranking general for their involvement in narco-terrorism. The indictment of Nicolas Maduro and his co-defendants alleges a conspiracy involving an extremely violent terrorist organization known as the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, the FARC, and an effort to flood the United States with cocaine. These FARC dissidents continue to be involved in drug trafficking and armed insurgency. The FARC gets this cocaine over into Venezuela and then is given safe haven by the regime to fly this cocaine from an area called Zulia near Lake Maracaibo up into Central America. Since 2016, this air bridge has been established and has grown 5-fold in just those 4 years. In addition, the regime is allowing these drug traffickers to take drugs by a maritime route into the Caribbean. We estimate that somewhere between 200 and 250 metric tons of cocaine are shipped out of Venezuela by these routes.
In the corridors of global power, where diplomacy and force blend in dangerous harmony, there are few leaders who find themselves hunted, marked, not for the sanctity of their office, but for the shadow of their deeds. In 2020, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro became one such man, his very existence stamped with a price, $15 million. The United States government, under the Trump administration, had issued a bounty for Maduro's capture, accusing him of turning Venezuela into a criminal state, a hub for drug trafficking. But if there's one thing that defines Nicolas Maduro, it's his defiance, and the bounty only stoked the fire of his rage. Donald Trump, you are a miserable human being, Maduro spat in one of his many televised tirades, his voice thick with venom. He called Trump a racist cowboy, drawing on imagery from an old world of frontier justice, where men like Trump played the role of sheriff, dictating law and order by the barrel of a gun. But Maduro, he would not be corralled. His words were not just insults, they were a declaration of war. If one day the imperialists and Colombian oligarchy dare to touch even a single hair, they will face the Bolivarian fury of an entire nation that will wipe them all out. He thundered, promising that any assault on him would be answered with devastating force. The charges leveled against him were staggering. The U.S. Department of Justice alleged that Maduro had conspired with Colombian rebels, turning the once proud revolution into a cartel that funneled hundreds of tons of cocaine into the United States. The indictment claimed that Venezuela had become a criminal enterprise at the service of drug traffickers and terrorist groups. Attorney General William Barr did not mince words. He painted Maduro as the orchestrator of a vast narco conspiracy, one that allegedly trafficked up to 250 metric tons of cocaine each year. The Maduro regime was awash in corruption and criminality, Barr said, as he outlined how the Bolivarian government had morphed into a machine of greed and violence. For the Venezuelan people, this was the great irony. While the nation suffered, its coffers depleted and its streets torn by protests, Maduro's inner circle grew fat off the proceeds of their illicit dealings. Barr's words echoed like a thunderclap across international headlines. It was an indictment not just of a man, but of an entire regime. Yet, in the face of this accusation, Maduro remained indignant. He did not cower. Instead, he turned the accusation on its head, deflecting the blame back onto his accusers. They ignored U.S. ally Colombia's role as the main source of the world's cocaine, he declared, casting doubt on the purity of those pointing fingers. His rhetoric was as sharp as ever, cutting through the global narrative with a raw, ferocious defense. To Maduro, this was not about law, but about politics. It was a plot to remove him, to strangle the Bolivarian Revolution by any means necessary. And yet, as bold as his defiance seemed, there was an unmistakable tremor of vulnerability beneath his words. The bounty was not just a legal maneuver, it was a weapon designed to undermine his rule, to paint him as a fugitive on the run. It was an offer to the world. Bring us Maduro. The specter of capture now hung over Maduro's head like a sword. With it, a chilling reminder that even presidents could be hunted. But if $15 million wasn't enough to bring him down, the stakes were about to rise. In September 2024, just when the dust seemed to settle, the U.S. Senate delivered yet another blow. Two Republican senators from Florida, Rick Scott and Marco Rubio, introduced a bill that would increase the reward for Maduro's capture to a staggering $100 million. This was no longer just a bounty. It was a declaration that Maduro had become one of the most wanted men on the planet. In a world where governments negotiate in shadows and back rooms, this was a neon sign screaming for justice. The bill, aptly named the Stop Maduro Act, came with a twist. The American taxpayers would not foot the bill for Maduro's capture. No, the $100 million reward would come from assets already frozen in the United States. Nearly $450 million worth seized from Maduro and his allies over the years. Assets that had once symbolized their power, now repurposed to fund their downfall. Maduro's reign had always been precarious, teetering on the edge of rebellion, sanctions, and survival. But now, his name was etched on a wanted poster, and his every move became a step towards potential capture. The coordinated unsealing of indictments against 14 officials attacked all the key planks of the corrupt Venezuelan regime. Attorney General Barr had said the walls were closing in. For Maduro, to remain in power is to live in a state of siege. He is not only the president of a nation in turmoil, but a man with a price on his head. His every word, every move is now a performance for survival. He had once promised to fight by whatever means necessary if anyone dared come for him, but with $100 million on the table, those words may soon be put to the test. Yet, for all the power and posturing, one truth remains. You would not want to be the current Venezuelan president, because being Nicolas Maduro is not simply a position of authority. It is a high-stakes game of survival, where the enemies are as numerous as the people plotting your downfall, and the stakes only grow higher with each passing day. The price of power has never been higher, and for Maduro, that price has been measured, quite literally, in hundreds of millions. And so, we reach the end of the tangled journey that is Nicolas Maduro's Venezuela, a journey defined not by triumph, but by survival, where every victory feels hollow and every loss pulls the nation deeper into the abyss. To be the president of Venezuela today is not to stand in the sunlight of power, but to walk through a landscape cloaked in shadow. From his rise as Chávez's heir to his precarious hold on the presidency, Maduro's story is one that oscillates between hope and despair, loyalty and betrayal. The Operation Gideon coup attempt, the bounty placed upon his head by the United States, these are not isolated events, but pieces of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that reveals the fragility of his reign, the desperation of those who seek to unseat him, and the cracks widening within the walls of the Bolivarian Revolution itself. Yet, through it all, Maduro persists. Like a man standing at the edge of a crumbling cliff, he leans into the storm, refusing to fall, his grip tightening on the nation slowly slipping through his fingers. The drones, the failed invasions, the sanctions, they circle him like predators, always waiting for the right moment to strike. But the true question lingers in the air. How long can this last? How long can a man endure the pressure of holding a nation together that wants to tear him apart? Nicolas Maduro may still hold the title of president, but what he truly holds is a heavy crown, one that has bent him low, one that threatens to crush him beneath its weight. The fire of a revolution he inherited now flickers weakly, casting long shadows across a nation desperate for change. And this is where we leave him, at the heart of a country in turmoil, fighting against forces from both within and without. To be Nicolas Maduro is to live in a world where you are both the ruler and the ruled. It is a life bound by chains of corruption, fear, and uncertainty. It is a fate that few would envy, and no one in their right mind would willingly choose.